The vast plains of the American West stretch endlessly, a sea of grasslands that once teemed with wildlife. Among the most iconic of these creatures was the mighty bison, a symbol of the land's abundance and strength. For centuries, indigenous peoples thrived in this environment, their lives intricately woven with the rhythms of the plains. The arrival of American settlers in the mid-19th century marked the beginning of a tragic tale of conflict and survival. Driven by manifest destiny, settlers sought to claim the Western territories. Indigenous tribes viewed the land as sacred and integral to their way of life. Clashes were inevitable as the two cultures collided, each with their own vision for the future of the plains. As the conflict escalated, the American government began to devise strategies to undermine indigenous resistance, including the systematic destruction of the bison herds. Bison were more than just a source of food for indigenous tribes. They were the cornerstone of their entire way of life. The great herds provided sustenance, materials for clothing, shelter, and tools. Every part of the animal was used, reflecting a deep respect for the natural world. The relationship between the tribes and the bison was a delicate balance, maintained through generations of knowledge and tradition. The seasonal migrations of the bison dictated the patterns of life for many indigenous communities. Hunting was done with great care and precision, ensuring that the herds remained healthy. This symbiotic relationship allowed both the people and the bison to thrive. But this intricate web of relationships would soon be threatened by the encroaching American settlers. For indigenous tribes, hunting was a way of life, requiring skill, knowledge, and respect for nature. Sustainable hunting ensured bison herds remained plentiful and maintained ecological balance. Techniques varied, but all shared the principle: take only what is needed. Tools were crafted for precision, ensuring a humane kill. Every part of the bison was used: meat, hides, bones, and sinews. The arrival of American settlers on the plains brought a seismic shift in the balance of power. Armed with new technology and driven by a desire for land and resources, settlers encroached on territories that indigenous peoples had occupied for generations. This invasion set the stage for a conflict that would have devastating consequences for both the bison and the tribes that depended on them. Settlers viewed the plains as a vast, untapped resource ripe for exploitation. Their goals were fundamentally at odds with the indigenous way of life. The expansion of the railroad network further fueled the settlers' advance. Railroads cut through the heart of the plains, bringing more people and goods into the region. This infrastructure development facilitated the rapid movement of settlers and soldiers. The railroads also played a critical role in the bison slaughter that was to come. By eliminating the bison, they aimed to remove the primary food source of the tribes, thereby weakening their resistance. President Andrew Johnson, who took office after Lincoln's assassination, faced the challenge of consolidating control over the Western territories. His administration's policies aimed to secure American dominance, often at the expense of indigenous peoples. One infamous strategy was the deliberate extermination of the bison herds. Johnson's advisors knew bison were crucial to indigenous independence. By targeting bison, the government aimed to force tribes into submission. Hunters and soldiers were enlisted to carry out the mass slaughter. Bounties for bison hides incentivized unprecedented killing. Special hunting trains transported hunters to shoot bison by the thousands. The impact was devastating, with the bison population plummeting. The systematic slaughter of bison was one of the most tragic and environmentally destructive campaigns in American history. Hunters, motivated by government incentives and commercial interests, decimated the herds with brutal efficiency. The plains, once alive with the thunderous sound of bison hooves, became eerily silent as the animals were driven to the brink of extinction. The scale of the slaughter was staggering. Hunters equipped with powerful rifles could kill dozens of bison in a single outing. The carcasses were often left to rot, with only the hides and tongues taken for sale. Railroads facilitated the mass killing by providing easy access to remote areas and transporting the harvested bison parts to markets in the east. Special hunting trains would bring groups of hunters to prime locations where they would shoot bison from the safety of the rail cars. The environmental impact was profound. The removal of such a keystone species disrupted the entire ecosystem of the plains. The loss of the bison also had a significant cultural and economic impact on indigenous tribes, who found themselves increasingly dependent on government rations. The psychological toll on indigenous communities was immense, as the bison were a central element of their culture, spirituality, and identity. The destruction of the bison herds had far-reaching consequences for indigenous communities. Deprived of their primary food source, many tribes faced starvation and were forced to rely on government rations. This dependency undermined their autonomy and eroded their traditional ways of life. The cultural and spiritual void left by the loss of the bison was equally devastating. The government rations provided were often inadequate and of poor quality. Indigenous peoples who had once thrived on nutrient-rich bison meat were now given meager supplies of flour, sugar, and lard. These new diets led to malnutrition and health problems, compounding the suffering of the tribes. The loss of the bison also meant the loss of materials for clothing, shelter, and tools, making survival even more difficult. The psychological impact was profound. The bison were deeply intertwined with the spiritual beliefs and cultural practices of many tribes. Their songs, dances, and stories celebrated the bison and their significance in the natural world. The extermination of the herds was not just a physical loss, but a spiritual and cultural one. The forced relocation to reservations further disrupted their traditional ways of life and confined them to areas that were often unsuitable for agriculture or hunting. As the American government tightened its grip on indigenous communities, it implemented a series of policies aimed at assimilation and control. One of the most insidious of these was the practice of forced infertility, which sought to reduce the population of indigenous peoples and disrupt their social structures. Forced infertility was carried out through a variety of means, including coercive sterilizations and the promotion of birth control without informed consent. Indigenous women were often targeted, with procedures performed in government-run hospitals and clinics. These practices were justified under the guise of public health and social improvement, but their true intent was to weaken the tribes and reduce their numbers. Assimilation policies extended beyond forced infertility. Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice their cultural traditions. These schools aimed to civilize the children, teaching them English and vocational skills, but the underlying goal was to sever their ties to their heritage and assimilate them into American society. The impact of these policies was devastating, with families torn apart and cultural knowledge lost. Despite these efforts, indigenous communities continued to resist and find ways to preserve their heritage. The combined effects of bison extermination, forced relocation, and assimilation policies led to a significant decline in indigenous sovereignty. The tribes, once autonomous and self-sufficient, were now largely dependent on the American government for survival. Their lands had been seized, their populations decimated, and their cultures under constant assault. Reservation life was harsh and restrictive. The land allotted to the reservations was often of poor quality, unsuitable for farming or hunting. The government controlled every aspect of life on the reservations, from food distribution to education. Indigenous peoples were subject to a paternalistic system that stripped them of their agency and autonomy. The legal and political status of indigenous tribes was also undermined. Treaties, which had initially been used to negotiate land and rights, were frequently broken or ignored by the American government. Efforts to regain sovereignty and rights have been ongoing. Indigenous leaders have fought tirelessly to reclaim their lands, protect their cultures, and secure recognition of their rights. While there have been some victories, the legacy of dispossession and marginalization continues to affect indigenous communities. The decline of indigenous sovereignty is a stark reminder of the injustices faced by these communities. The story of the bison did not end with their near extinction in the 19th century. Efforts to save and restore bison populations began in the early 20th century, led by conservationists, indigenous groups, and government agencies. These efforts have had some success, and today bison herds are slowly making a comeback. Conservation programs have been established to protect and manage bison populations. National parks and wildlife reserves play a crucial role in these efforts, providing safe habitats for bison to roam and reproduce. Indigenous communities have been at the forefront of bison restoration efforts, recognizing the cultural and ecological importance of the bison. Many tribes have established their own conservation programs. Despite these positive developments, challenges remain. Bison populations are still a fraction of what they once were, and their habitats continue to face threats from development and climate change. The current status of bison populations is a mixed picture of hope and challenges.